All right, let's get started. Pretty good group. So this is CDNI, Content Delivery Network Interconnect. If that's the group you're expecting to be in, welcome. If not, you're also still welcome. First up, the note well. Everybody should have seen this before. These are the rules by which you agree to participate in the IETF and how the IETF deals with intellectual property. So if you haven't read it, you should read through all this, but note well that you agree to all of this. So this is CD&I. We haven't met since Bangkok, so it's been a while, IETF 103, but we're happy to be back with a live session. As you all know from the list, Phil Sorber stepped down, and he was replaced by Sanjay Mishra. And so we'd all like to thank Phil for the work that he put in, and thank Sanjay for stepping up to be our new co-chair. So we have one session today. We only have an hour, and we have a lot of stuff to get through, so we'll try and get through it quick. Blue sheets are taken care of by MeetEcho. If anybody wants to volunteer to be a Jabber scribe or a minute taker, that would be great. I will also be taking notes as well. But I will get us to the agenda. Oh, first, working group milestones. So actually, interestingly enough, we have been doing work, even though we haven't been meeting. Since the last IETF, we did finish the request routing extensions, and it was published as RFC 8804. You can see that we have 3 additional milestones that we agreed to. URI signing has been submitted to the IESG, and Phil's going to give us a quick update. And then last time we adopted 2 new drafts, which were the HTTPS delegation, which Frederick's going to talk to us about, and the CDNI control interface, the triggers updates, which Nir is going to talk about today. So here's our agenda. If anybody wants to.
Just a quick thing. Can we get someone to do the scribing for us? Did we get confirmation as to anybody who's taking the notes for the meeting? Any volunteers?
Anyone wants to just raise their hand?
It's a fairly straightforward process, and just writing very briefly what is being said. Not every part of the discussion, but just the key points, or just anything that is important that you will note and share. Any volunteers?
I'll handle the notes afterwards if no one else really wants to do it. But I'm going to try and keep moving this forward since we do have a packed agenda. So Phil will give us an update on URI signing. Frederick will give us an update on HTTPS delegation. Nir's going to talk about triggers. Glenn has a draft submitted on additional metadata objects. Andrew is going to talk about capacity advertisement. And then Nir has another draft on footprints. And then we will try and wrap it up. If there are no objections, we will move on to Phil. You're up first. If you'd like, I will share for you.
Good, thank you. All right, URI signing, the never-ending story. It was in last call back in February. We had some feedback from MNOT. This is kind of related to his Get Off My Lawn dissertation, and was concerned about how we were specifying things in the URI in the document. We were kind of jumping into the namespace and polluting it there. So I made some changes around that. And then the IESG had a ton of feedback. They were very concerned about client IP. I have 4 asterisks there because there were actually 4 different people that had something different to say about that, primarily about the usefulness and privacy concerns. So usefulness is like, oh, somebody's behind NAT, or they switch from Wi-Fi to mobile or stuff like that. Was this something really useful? And then also privacy concerns. Obviously, people were happy that we were encrypting things, but they still were concerned about it. Then they were also very concerned about the shared keys. We do also have public key crypto, but I think really the problem that it comes down to is that we talk about client IP and shared keys at the forefront, and then kind of also talk about other things. And I think they would prefer that it would be the other way around. Like, okay, we know you guys need to support this because people want it, but let's de-emphasize it. And also, in security concerns, really detail why these things are so bad. There was some questioning about a lot of the shoulds that we had in there. They asked why wasn't it must, and what was some advice to implementers as to when they could ignore the should. So I think going to have to look through those and either come up with reasons why people would want to ignore them or upgrade them to musts. And there was also a lot of concern about the advice to the designated experts. I'll be honest, personally, I had a lot of trouble coming up with what kind of advice we would want for when adding new claims in. So if anybody has any input there, that would be helpful. The other feedback we got was from a member of this working group, Chris Lemons. So part of the MNOT feedback was about removing the way we specified the URI attribute and so we removed that and basically just said use pass style or query style parameters. Chris is concerned about the fact that we have this as a must, but we don't actually point to any document that talks about how to parse those. So I think we came up with a solution where we're basically going to reference the output of the URI template ROC. I don't see a problem with it. I'll be honest, it feels a little weird because there's nothing in there that talks about how to actually interpret that, but at least it's something more tangible. So yeah, and also the timeline. I didn't put a bullet for this, but I'm working on this now completely on my own time. Work's not supporting me. They're not paying me to be here today. And being able to get out this summer and not be stuck in a house was much more attractive than working on this draft. So it's been, that's why it's taken so long after last call to get to these things. So I'm still planning on working on it, but yeah, that's where I'm at. Any questions?
So do you think that, do you have a time frame in which you think we can't get to this? Can we get this done by next IETF?
Yes, I think, I mean, that's 3 months from now, 4 months from now.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. I mean, really it's been about me not having enough side time and being able to go do things this summer while the weather's nice and everything. And 4 months from now, I don't think that's going to be a problem. In fact, we might not even be able to go out 4 months from now, the way things are looking some places.
Chris.
If I opened a PR with some suggested text around what we had discussed on the mailing list?
Did you say you did open a PR, or are you asking if I?
No, I said would it be helpful if I did that? I was gonna just absolutely do it, but then the meeting was today and I didn't have time.
Yeah, that's fine. I don't mind that at all.
That would be great. If anyone has suggestions that they want to submit a PR for, any help that we can give Phil would be awesome.
And also, if anybody looked through the comments from last call from the IESG and has any feedback or anything that they wanted to share with me to respond to them or to make changes in the document, feel free to let me know.
All right. There are no other comments?
Thanks.
Thank you, Phil. Next up is Frederick. Let me share some slides for you. And you have 5 minutes.
Hi. Can you hear
Fred,
me?
you're mute.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Hi, everybody. So I'm presenting the status of our draft CDNI interfaces HTTPS delegation. Next slide, please. Just a quick reminder. Today, currently at the IETF, we have a bunch of delegation methods ongoing, which are the RFC 8739, which is the star delegation. We have the delegated credential also that might be going into RFC2. Next slide, please. So our draft basically is using those, try to refer to those delegation methods. So this draft we are presenting here is to allow the bootstrapping of the content delivery delegation for those certificate-based content delegation methods between a UCDN and a delegate DCDN. This draft was adopted as a working group draft. Next slide, please. So currently, what we are doing in this draft is to extend the current metadata interface model with the pass metadata object as defined in the RFC 806. And we're adding new delegation method objects. So far, we have added the Acme star delegation methods, and the subset delegation methods are yet called delegated credentials. So we have an example below. Here we can see that the pass metadata is extended with a generic metadata type, on which you can provide the ECME star delegation method in this example. Then you provide a bunch of parameters that will be able to that will be needed for the UCDN to bootstrap the delegation to a DCDN. Next slide, please. So what's next about that? We have in mind of prototyping this draft to increase a bit to reinforce the draft a bit. And for that, we need maybe some additional people. And the second step would be the working group last call. So I'm pretty confident that the draft is quite ready for that. So, but yeah, it's up to you. Thank you.
On that last point, do we think that we are ready for last call? I think the last time we talked about this, we were still wondering about the dependencies for the metadata, the protocols for which we are adding metadata, and what was their maturity status, and if they're all ready, or whether some need to be split out of this draft, or is it just the Acme star?
Yeah, the Acme Star is RFC, so it's a pretty finished. But yeah, as far the delegated credentials is concerned, I don't know whether the draft will be RFC soon or not. But yeah, I agree with this remark.
Yes, so I think we should consider whether we want to split this draft, and if we do split it and we think Acme Star is ready, then I'm happy to do a pre-review on it. But I think we should answer that question first and see if we want to wait for the other methods.
Yeah.
Guillaume? Guillaume?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Okay, go. Frederick, question: why do you attach the new objects to the path match property or object? Why not attaching to the host match object?
Well, it was our first idea was to restrict the scope of the delegation into a specific path on the URL. But so far, if you have any better idea for extending the scope, then we would be pleased to add.
Okay, no, it's just I don't think it should be mutually exclusive. I mean, you can do that for the path match, but why not having the options to select a method for also the entire host metadata, host match? Well, that's my point. I mean, you know that basically you can attach metadata to the host match, and if there is a path match, then the priority will be given to the path match. So
yeah, sounds good. Yeah, we could extend.
Okay. So is it still the times to bring to you some modification, or because I'm not very familiar about the status of this of the draft, because you were saying that it's almost done?
Yeah,
There's
you
still
can
time.
still, yeah.
So sorry, Kevin, I didn't
There's
catch
plenty
it.
of time. You should
Okay.
send an email to the mailing list. We're running behind already, so if we could take this discussion there, I think it's a great discussion, and we should have it. And so, thanks.
No, I think the subject was part of the SVA. I mean, it was in the one of the SVA point or subject of interest anyway. And in Broadpeak, we are very interested in that topics also. So that's why I maybe bring some suggestions to enhance a bit the current draft. Yeah, thank you.
Excellent. Thanks. Sanjay, did you have something quick?
Yes, real quick. Without the chair hat on, I just wanted to circle back that we may have to split this document because the delegated credentials is still waiting for the chair, for the TLS chair to go ahead and propose that into a standard. So not sure what the timing is and what the holdup there is. So potentially this could be split and then revisit again when the TLS is RFC'd. The subset document is RFC'd, that's it.
I would encourage the authors to take that suggestion and we can discuss that. Guillaume, I'm going to have to cut you off because we're 5 minutes behind already, and I want to get to the rest of the presentations. I apologize.
Okay.
But Nir is up next with triggers.
Hi there.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi all. Thank you for joining. So my name is Nir Sofer. I'm a software engineer at Quilt. Okay, let's just start. As part of CDNI, Quilt is part of is a founding member of the SVA, and actually in the context of open caching, we got to some experience with implementing some of those the RFCs we relies heavily on, and found some some items to improve, specifically in RFC 8007 in the CDNI control interface. So just a quick recap. The CDNI control interface allows the absent CDN to manage content and metadata held by the downstream CDN. For example, preposition or a purge of content. As you can see in the visual, the basic flow starts with the absent CDN approaching the downstream CDN with a request for creating a trigger, which is actually the command to be done, to be executed. The downstream CDN creates the triggers as well as generating the trigger ID and reply to the absent CDN with the ID, which allows the absent CDN to keep on monitoring the trigger execution while done by the downstream CDN. As you may already know, Sanjay and Ori have worked on a draft that had some improvements to this control interface. The draft was already adopted by this forum, I think in the previous meeting. And we are now in the process of taking this draft, merging it into the original RFC in order to create a current and simplified RFC, and maybe even obsolete the RFC 8007. So the first added functionality with this draft is the trigger extensions. The RFC 8007, the trigger object is built of a closed set of properties, and there is no mechanism for adding additional information or instruction on how to execute the different triggers. For example, if you want a specific location or time for the trigger to be executed, let's say we want the trigger to be executed, the preposition of content to be done only in Buenos Aires, Argentina, at 3 a.m. local time. So the draft suggests a new generic extension mechanism similar to RFC 8006 with the generic metadata, where the trigger, the version 2 of the trigger, has a property of having a list of extensions. This is an open list, so once we define more and more extensions, we don't need to change the trigger object format or create a new version of it. We need just to register the new extensions, and the first two extensions to be registered are the time and location extensions. Next, please. The second addition by this RFC, by this draft, is adding the CDN ID to the error when returned as part of the status request. As you can see in the visual and the sequence diagram, there are situations that the trigger needs to be propagated from one or more CDN to the others, to another. In this case, the absent CDN send a trigger to a transit CDN that propagates it to a downstream CDN. And in the case the trigger fails at one of the downstream CDNs, the upstream CDN would get as a response to the status request, it will get an error, but it will have the upstream CDN will have no information where the error occurred. The additional fields allow the transit CDN, if he likes to, if he wishes to do it, it allows him to expose in which downstream CDN the failure occurred. Next, please. The last addition in the adopted draft is new content selection methods. RFC, the original RFC already defined quite a few content or metadata selection method, URLs, patterns, and the draft suggests two new methods. One is the regular expression, and the other is a playlist, HLS dash, just following the manifest. So the trigger v2 object has now a new property, which is the content regex or the content playlist, which actually brings me to the next point. Please. Next slide, please. Okay, so as you can see, the trigger properties are listed at the left side of the screen. We have quite a few methods to select metadata or select content, and we added the new two blue lines. And every time we would like to add new method for content selection, we will need to change to create a new version of the trigger object. And I think it would be preferable to hold an object list that can be an open list that holds generic trigger objects that specify which content or metadata we need to work on, the trigger need to be executed on, and this will give us the benefit that every time a new content selection method is introduced, we would just need to add it to the registry and not change the trigger object. Please note that this is a new suggestion. It was not adopted by the working group before, and I would be happy to further discuss it. But first of all, I would like to adopt the new draft we have, please. Okay, so implementing all the proposed modifications, the next step is to publish a second edition of this the control interface RFC, as all changes were integrated and merged into the original RFC, and we create a current and simple, more simple document that can be followed, and it should be safe to obsolete RFC 807, as all the information would be in the new draft. So before I open this for questions, I would like to ask the chairs whether this draft can be accepted as a working group draft.
I think that it makes sense. We agreed that, that it made more sense as a replacement for 8007 than it did as an extension to 8007. So I don't see why we wouldn't accept this. The content is essentially the same, though we are proposing some additional, upgrades. But I think we do have to go through. We probably have to go through a readoption on the list. But I don't know if Francesca has an opinion on this one. But I think otherwise we can go ahead, if there are no objections in the room, we can go ahead and send out an adoption email on the list and just confirm on the list.
Thank you.
We're still running 5 minutes behind, so if there are no other questions on this, there are a number of threads ongoing on the list. I do encourage folks to go and read those and comment and put in your 2 cents. But otherwise, thank you, Nir.
Thank you.
And up next is Glenn with some metadata.
Lots of metadata.
Lots of metadata. We'll try and get through it very quickly.
Yeah, no, I
you
can move through this. I can move through this pretty quickly. See, I'm Glenn Goldstein. I'm in the CDN product team at Lumen. You may know Lumen from its former names of CenturyLink and before that Level 3. So within the Streaming Video Alliance, we took on the need for an industry standard for configuring CDNs, both in the open caching sort of use cases and in the traditional use cases of content providers managing one or more CDNs. Of course, we wanted to use the existing CDNI standard whenever possible, and we identified gaps between the CDNI 8006 metadata model and capabilities we see in most commercial CDNs today. You can go to the next slide. So as we look at the CDN metadata model, we wanted to just use 8006 right out of the box. But again, in doing that analysis in comparison with what's out there in current commercial CDNs, we identified many extensions required to the metadata model itself, and that'll be the focus of this discussion. In addition, we identified things we'd like to extend, at least for the SVA use cases, for the API, how we actually publish the metadata model between entities. And that really isn't the topic of this discussion, but it is part of the overall SVA work to extend the interface as well. But we'll focus here just on the model itself. So move ahead. Yeah, so all the extensions we're talking about here fall into the categories listed, and I'll kind of just team through them, but all of this will be realized essentially with a set of new generic metadata objects. Enhancing the source definitions was a key area of focus for us, enabling the specification to load balance between multiple origins and to specify rules for how you might fail over from one origin to another. We added some authentication methods that we're proposing to deal with Amazon S4, AWS v4 auth, simple header authentication. There's a series of additions we're making to allow for more refined cache control, specifically for a content provider to instruct their CDNs or for an upstream CDN to instruct downstream CDNs about how they might handle requests for stale content. So there's policies that can say, if the content is stale, go ahead and serve it, and then for some period of time, and then asynchronously go back to an origin to refresh. You might do this to prevent a sick origin from being flooded with additional requests. We've got positive and negative cache control policies, what to do about caching errors. We've got controls in there to allow you to say that a cache should be bypassed. That may be useful for testing or benchmarking purposes. And there's capabilities here to dynamically generate cache keys. An example here may be if a response header from an origin contains information that needs to override the cache key, which typically would just be from the request path. We've got capabilities added for dynamically generating and interpreting CORS headers. Traffic type metadata, this will be hints saying whether the traffic type is live streaming, on-demand streaming, large object download. No rules are specified about what to do with that, but it can be implementation-specific instructions that a downstream CDN might find quite helpful within their own implementations. The idea to tag certain configurations with service or property IDs, maybe on a path inspection, if the path begins with a certain route, you want to tag it with one service identifier versus another for billing or log control purposes within a multi-tenant CDN. There's several open caching configuration metadata objects we've put in here to control request routing, OCN node selection. We get into those a little bit later. private features. So while private features can certainly be implemented by adding your own new generic metadata objects, as we've done here, we wanted to have a formal process for specifying private features. Then on the right side here, there's a whole suite of enhancements we'll get into that are all in the category of what we'll call processing stages. Basically, at various stages within the request processing pipeline, you may want to rewrite URIs, you may want to inspect HTTP headers and modify HTTP headers, you may want to generate a synthetic response. And to do all this, you'll need some sort of an expression language to say, hey, if the user agent is this type of browser, then set these cache control policies, or ignore this status response from an origin and replace it with another status response. And again, this is all driven from use cases we see regularly in the CDN industry. Next slide, please. Yeah, you may want to zoom up larger to see this better. There we go. Yeah, so what it comes down to, the top part here is the CDNI structural model as documented in 8006, and we're not touching that. There's no changes proposed there. Really, the changes here are 15 new generic metadata top-level objects. That's the ones in red here. And in the current draft we've submitted to the IETF, we list out these 15 objects with just a very high-level definition. Many more details will come. The existing generic metadata objects from 8006, the ones listed here on the right, we have not touched those. Go ahead, next slide. Yeah, so as I mentioned before, one of the major extensions here is this idea of processing stages. The idea that metadata and rules can be applied at any one of these 4 stages that we see typical in a CDN request processing pipeline. Processing really on the inbound as requests come in from the client, processing on the outbound as things come from the origin, before they go into cache, that's this origin response C here in the picture, when processing possibly as you take items out of the cache and you want to adjust the response in some way before you send them back to the client. Go ahead, next slide. So the processing stages model, again, this will all be included in the RFC, in the draft, is all a model built within a generic metadata object of processing stages. And this really allows you to say at each processing stage what rules you want to apply. So within the existing host match and path match structure, you can now say, great, now that I've matched at that level, when responses come from the origin and I'm matching on this particular, say, HTTP status code, go ahead and adjust the cache values, possibly overriding what came from the origin. There's ability to do a transform. Often we find in the CDN world, we need to add headers, or we need to suppress response headers coming from an origin, maybe for certain user agents, because it will break some bad client code. So there's a rich ability here to generally inspect and manipulate HTTP requests and responses. Next slide, please. And just to kind of complete the discussion, the capabilities interface is defined in 8007 is a great starting point. Within the SVA, we plan on making some extensions to that. On the capability side, as we add all the new capabilities I just highlighted for metadata objects, not all CDNs will support them. The FCI metadata object is perfectly well suited as is to just add the names of those new generic metadata objects to say you support them. And we're also going to look at add some capability for a fine-grained advertisement within a generic metadata object for a downstream CDN to say, I support this portion of it, but not the next portion of it. Next slide, please. Yeah, and this is extending the metadata interface, which I was just touching on. Within the SVA, we will work to extend the interface as defined in 8007, in 8006, and then we will be adding an advanced API to deal with more of the lifecycle management workflow around publishing and versioning these configurations, extending the href concept to have names listed of generic metadata objects can be reused. That work may or may not find its way into the IETF, but it just kind of rounds out our general metadata enhancement. Okay, that's it for the presentation. Is there interest in this work either going forward as an extension to RFC 8006, or it can be a standalone because it really doesn't change anything in 8006. Effectively, it's a new set of objects.
Right. I think this is exactly what we intended when we designed the metadata interface. Right. It has a generic object, and you can extend it, and you can add new things. And we really wanted the industry to come up with what we needed to add in order to make this more usable. We added the basics. I think that, we've already done the request routing extensions draft, which was 2 or 3 new metadata objects. I think this falls into that same bucket, and it's exactly the type of thing we want to see. I think the draft is very light on details currently, and so we would need a lot more information. Yeah. I think some of these are questionable. The private features and processing stages, we may want to split out because they are, they may be more contentious. I don't know. We'll know more once we have more details. But I think that, update the draft, and there's a discussion started on the list. I think that's a great next step.
Yeah, the draft is very thinned down from a much, much larger, like an 80-page document within the SVA that details all of this.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, if we could get more information on that, I think we can do a better job of evaluating where to take this.
Yeah, I'll work with Sanjay on that.
Awesome. If there's nothing else, we're even further behind now, so I will kick it over to Andrew.
Hello. All right, so I know we're behind time, so I'm going to try and keep this quick. This is a very chewy subject, and I'm expecting there to be a lot of questions, so I'm going to really try and speed through to leave time for questions. So once again, my name is Andrew Ryan. I'm a principal architect at Limelight Networks. Similar to Glenn, what I'm going to be presenting here today is the result of a working group from the Streaming Video Alliance. Similar to, and my presentation is going to look like Glenn's because I took his template and I copied it. So thank you, Glenn. But the draft, we have submitted a draft surrounding what I'm going to be presenting today. It is once again also very light because while we have a good concept of the high level and the intention of what we want to accomplish, we're still working through some of the logistics of the JSON payloads and just validating that it works correctly in the whole spirit of the ecosystem. So the mission of what we're presenting is we want to be able to provide an interface that allows content providers, service providers, upstreams, downstream CDNs, of a way to understand what is an appropriate level of traffic to delegate in the first place while maintaining certain levels of performance. And we'd really like to adhere to the great foundation that's been laid out already by CDNI, and particularly the FCI and metadata interfaces. Next slide, please. So the goals of this are, and I hate reading slides, but I think it kind of bears to talk about this a little bit, is we want to, once again, provide a framework to exchange information about traffic delegation decisions. This information should be scoped to a CDNI footprint, so it similar to FCI capabilities. The scoping will also be restricted to, or allowable to be filtered by a host. The information that we're going to be signaling in terms of capacity are going to be specific to the delegation relationship. It's going to be specific to the upstream CDN and the downstream CDN. It's not going to be the case that the downstream CDN is going to be advertising all available capacity. It's going to be basically a not to exceed, or NTE. It's how much am I willing to allow you upstream CDN to have. This next part is actually very important. We're going to go into a little bit later, but we want to define limits in an unambiguous and mutually understood terms. And then lastly, we want to support the various phases of the communication, including bootstrapping. And then we also want to make sure that the upstream, we can support upstream continuously polling the downstream for this information. We want to allow the downstream to tell the upstream there have been changes to this information. And we also want to kind of add in this newer phase of
allowing the upstream to ask the downstream CDN to reconsider limits that may have been previously advertised. Next slide, please. So starting off, I kind of touched on the relationship that the downstream and the upstream, the signals back and forth are going to be specific to them, and they're going to be basically not to exceeds or capacity limits. So we'd like to treat this capacity limit as an FCI capability. As we mentioned, it's going to be the data signal back and forth is going to be specific to the delegation relationship. It's going to be scoped out to the CDNI footprint as well as the ability to scope it by host. And so based on this, we'd like to extend or suggest an extension to add a new FCI payload called FCI capacity limits. The structure of the JSON, as we kind of roughly sketched it out today, is outlined in the 00 draft. Next slide, please. Now, the key part, and where I alluded to earlier about the mutually understood terms, this is where we're going to kind of come into that. In that, we're intending in that last payload, the capacity limits payload, to say here's how many gigabits per second you're allowed to delegate to us as a hard not to exceed limit. That doesn't necessarily have meaning though. What is a gigabit per second? How do I know how much I'm actually delegating? That's where the telemetry is going to come into play. What we intend to do in that FCI capacity limits payload is to link out or provide a direct source of data which will provide near real-time telemetry to show how much usage by an upstream CDN is currently being delegated to a downstream, and they and that telemetry source should share all the same scoping that we're providing in the capacity limit, including which would really be the footprint and the host. So in order to at the same point, this would also have to necessarily require advertising that we support this particular capability. So we're proposing that we're going to add in another payload of FCI capabilities to say that we support certain amounts of telemetry objects. Right off the bat, I think the goal that we're coming up with is to kind of define more of a generic telemetry source, with the hopes that down the line we could discover, or I guess explore formalizing more of a formalized telemetry interface itself. Now, this is once again going to be a debatable item because there already is the logging interface that's defined, but there's not necessarily a clear path to using the logging interface to gather near real-time aggregated metrics that we would need to associate with some of these typical capacity limits we're looking to advertise. Next slide, please. And this last component is really meant to facilitate one of the data communication workflows, in that the upstream CDN would like to query or ask the downstream or solicit the downstream CDN to reconsider capacity limits and provide suggestions of what limits they might want to consider. In order to do this, we're proposing a new generic metadata object which would allow or facilitate this communication. Specifically the requested capacity limits object here. Next slide, please. So once again, this is a very bare bones diagram, but it's really just meant to give a very high level view of what we're trying to outline here, which is the upstream CDN would look towards the downstream CDN, get the capabilities advertised through the FCI interface. One of those new payload items would be a capacity limit, which would define a particular metric such as gigabits per second, and also outline which telemetry source is going to be provided that will outline how much current usage of that metric is being delegated. Then the upstream CDN would go pull that telemetry source, understand what the current utilization is, then compare that to what the limit that was provided to it was, and adjust the traffic delegation decisions based on that. So I sped through that extremely fast because I know we're light on time. The draft itself is very light on details. So I guess we wanted to bring this forth for consideration, commentary, and to see if there is interest in commenting on what we're proposing here.
So I'll insert myself into the queue. This is an interesting subject, I think. It is a subject that we explicitly punted on when we originally created the working group for various reasons. If there is interest within the working group to take that up, I think that's okay. The interesting part is because the CDNI working group does not have the protocol for FCI. If we're defining metadata objects and we're defining FCI objects, I think that's within our scope. If we are talking about changes to the protocol itself, since we all agreed previously that Alto owns that protocol, there's some amount of discussion we probably have to have there. But I think, yeah, the draft is a little light. I haven't commented on it yet, but some additional details around that I think would be interesting, and I would be interested in having others in the working group comment as well.
100% agree. In terms of the Alto, we explicitly didn't talk about the transport mechanism. This was mainly whether we use Alto or, as the Open Caching Initiative in SVA is intending to use another framework. I think we're going to still need to define these payload types or just the encapsulation of the data. So that's why we wanted to bring forth at least these 3 items that we're looking to formally define within as particular payloads or metadata items so that they could be transported. And yes, the draft is very light. Once again, similar to Glenn, we have a larger working document on the SVA where we're stepping through a lot of this. As that fleshes out, we will be updating the draft to include a lot more information, a lot of context of why we may have chosen certain paths, et cetera, et cetera.
Excellent. I think that works. I think once the next version of the draft is out, I encourage everyone in the working group to go and read it and comment on it, and we can see where that goes. All right, Nir, you have 8 minutes left, so I'm gonna let you have most of that, and we'll do a very quick chair wrap up after that.
Okay. So let's run through it. I'm now in this session. I would like to go over new footprint types we would like to suggest. So again, a quick recap. RFC 8006 defines the footprint types. We have IPv4 subnets, ASNs, country codes, and it also defines the footprint object, which specify a type and a list of values of this type, and it's act as a filter. The client needs to match this filter. So RFC 8008 uses this definition of a footprint object. It allows the specification of each allows to set for each capacity the corresponding footprint. So in this example, the capacity is available at the ASN 64496, but only for a client residing in the US. Next, please. So the new footprint type we would like to add is based on ISO 31662. This ISO takes the country code and actually go down one level geographically. So it can be states in the US, as in the visual, province in Canada, metropolitan in France, etc. So we build a new footprint type, which starts with the country code and, like example, US, and then a dash and the subdivision code. In this example, it will be NY for New York. So in the bottom example, you can see a footprint that is valid for a footprint object that is valid for New York and New Jersey. Next, please. Thanks. You know what? It's a good time to stop. If any question regarding this new footprint type are out there, so because I want the approval of the new footprint type and also take this draft into to be adopted as a working group document. Okay, it's
I think it makes sense. I think
okay.
Limiting by state makes sense.
Good. So let's focus. Let's move to the next slide. Let's focus again on RFC on the capability, footprint and capability mechanism, and on the narrowing semantic of it. Okay, as I said before, in order for a client to be match the footprint filter here and say the capability is available for this client, the client need to match both filters, both footprint object, the ASN and the country code. Next, please. So now I'm simplifying the example. In this case, the client should only reside in the US. Next, please. And what happens if I want the capability to say the capability is valid, is available for all clients in the US, and additionally a client in Nova Scotia, in a province of Canada. So one would might want to define it like I wrote it here, but again, the narrowing semantics of this list causes it to create an empty list of clients because no clients resides both in the US and Nova Scotia. Next, please. So the way it is solved by RFC 8008 is by redefining the same capability twice. Okay, we once defined the capability for the US clients and once defined the capability for Nova Scotia clients. Next, please. The narrowing, there is also an additive semantics in the footprint object, which is built on the footprint value list. Okay, if we want to say that the capability is available for client in the US and Canada, we could have used the additive list that is part of the footprint value. Okay, so as I see, the narrowing semantic is a bit constraining, and we need some additive semantics. And I would like to suggest to use this additive already existing additive semantics, and in order to create a larger and more complicated structures. By defining a new footprint type, which is the footprint union. The footprint union is actually a new footprint type whose values are a footprint object. So in the following example, we first go to the not read area, the ASN. The client must belong to the specific ASN, and then the next filter says the client must reside in one either in the US or Nova Scotia, because we have an additive semantics between the footprint values in the list. Name is still debatable. That's it. I would be happy if we can discuss this. If anyone have other ideas of how to solve the issue, and if not, to adapt this draft as a working document. The chairs sees fit.
So, as the author of all of the footprint stuff, I agree that both of these are useful and necessary, and I apologize for missing this additive semantic footprint union piece when we did it originally. I personally think that this makes sense for us to do, and I don't see that. I don't know if anyone has any objections to it. It's pretty straightforward, but if folks have thoughts on this, I would encourage you to, I guess, take it to the list since we only have 20 seconds left. But if if not, I think that maybe we can go ahead and consider adopting this, but we can take that to the list and offline. I appreciate everybody showing up to the CDNI session. Thank you so much. It's great to be back at IETF. I guess we will follow up with all of these things on the list, and if you have thoughts or anything that you want to say, please send mail to the list, and we'll see you next time in Madrid, hopefully in person. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a great day,
Thank
night,
you.
evening.